So I think the problem for the military, if an administration starts to request things of them that military members may regard as improper or immoral or illegal, I think it's a particularly difficult question for military members, even more so than for civil servants or everyday citizens. And the reason for that is because our Constitution uh, deeply is concerned about military deference to civilian authority and wants to avoid the coming of autocracy through some kind of military coup. So its legal emphasis is consistently on military compliance with legitimate civilian requests. Um, and that leaves a very narrow arena of legal protection for service members if the orders they receive are, in their minds, illegal. If they are objectionable but not illegal, there really isn't any protection. And if they're illegal, in the eyes of the service member, the service member needs to recognize that they would run a substantial gauntlet of challenges associated with is this insubordination on their part,
Yeah.
the order really illegal, they're subject to court martial, they're subject to dismissal. So they're very high stakes for them if they attempt to resist an order which is properly derived from the president or commanding officers. Um, so I think it's hard for everyone if you have a president or an administration that isn't deferent to the law. But I think it's especially hard for military members. And as a practical matter, I think we ought to recognize that um, it's not likely that the military will be a major source of dissent from an administration if the administration moves in directions that are others might regard as improper.
Right. That's really interesting. Yeah, you're right. So we're looking at public dissent then, citizen dissent, as being almost a more powerful tool in a situation like this.
Not just more powerful, but more feasible. It's
Feasible.
difficult for citizens to speak out, but it's insubordination for a military subordinate to speak out against a senior officer. There are some channels for internal protest, but that's a different thing.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah.
Well, I think in this dimension, it will be difficult. There are there are extreme circumstances, and I think we've had some, for example, when we got into the tension in the United States over the torture of terrorists or accused terrorists. Um, but you see how the mainstream debate really needs to be outside the military. Well, let me give you three answers. One thing that particularly bothers me, one reason for being agnostic, if you will, about what might happen and not getting too much into prediction, and one reason for feeling better about it. The thing that bothers me in the context we're talking about the military is that it's a great American tradition that the military is not politicized. And many senior, and for that matter, less senior members of the military have gone to considerable lengths, I think, to protect that tradition. So I would be very disturbed if, for example, there were efforts to decide who got promoted in the military based on political criteria. This so and so was outspoken about this or voted for that or whatever.
Mhm.
Um, and I fear that risk. I think we need all of us to resist that. Um, the the thing that makes me somewhat agnostic is that any number of things could happen, and I think that it's a case that very frequently predictions about the future and things like this say more about the people doing the predicting than they do about the future. where their particular concerns lie. Now, I've just referenced one of my concerns, but I wouldn't be very confident in predicting what might happen, whether it would be terrible or just objectionable or in fact not playing out in the military realm. I just don't think there's a lot of reward to trying to predict.
Yeah.
Having said that, one source of comfort for me is that I think people lose track of how normal, both in societies in general and in American society in particular, serious contention and sense of upheaval is, and how these things historically move back and forth between uh, one commitment or a level of activity and then an oscillation to the opposite. If you think how this country was born in the context of fundamental disputes about slavery, and how for the first 60 years of the Republic, those disputes festered and created extreme antagonisms, great difficulties in all domains, and then a civil war which killed more Americans than any other war. And if you look at the post-Civil War period, Reconstruction and lynchings in the South and fundamental upheavals over what segregation means and so forth, you see that. But not just those issues. Andrew Jackson's administration is characterized by a wave of populism and throwing out office holders and severe assault on Indians and expulsion of them from various territories. And then you get reactions to that that are more protective and more thoughtful. Ulysses Grant, wild corruption, lots of problems in the late 1800s associated with populism and monopolies and upheaval, and World War One, basic issues about sedition, um, and huge fights internally in the U.S. about isolationism versus engagement in the period after that. And just in my own lifetime, McCarthyism, the assassinations associated with Jack Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, the extreme divisions associated with Vietnam. So I
Mhm.
think we tend to kind of filter all that out and forget how much contention there is historically in this society. So we've been robust in the face of that contention, and I very much hope we would continue to be in the time ahead. Well, I think we all tend to live in the moment, and the present is so much more visibly dominant for us. And we have discount rates and uncertainties about the future, and the past recedes into a kind of hazy atmosphere with lots of the noise filtered out. When we think back on it, we see it as a more straight line than it is.
That's really true because in the midst of it, you can't really see it. And if looking at it in the past through the rear view mirror, it does look linear and like a solid event rather than all of the fragmentation that really was going on. I remember the 60s well, and it was, year after year of insanity.
Yeah,
But every time something happened, I thought that was the end of it. You
yeah,
know, I think that's our
yeah.
hope. Yes.
Of
Uh,
course, no doubt when the college students that you refer to look at us, they say it's just remarkable how little we realize about what's happening at the present and how we live in the past and so on. So, yeah, as a lawyer, I think the courts do represent a significant bulwark, hopefully one that will stand and represent a degree of impartiality and measured consideration as we go through political tumult in the years immediately ahead. Um, I don't think it's so unusual that we find a lot of contention around these court decisions. Coming back to my point about sort of cycles and oscillation, I think it's really extraordinary how much change of a fundamental kind there's been over the course of lifetimes like yours and mine, lifetimes that stretch back to the middle of the 20th century. Um, I think really never in human history has there been so much rethinking of issues like attitudes towards race, gender, the environment, sexuality. Um, it's pretty fundamental. And it doesn't surprise me that there are reactions against that, given the magnitude of that. And how could there not be? And it's natural, I think, that there would be both some um, going further than the society is willing to tolerate, and then some reeling back, and then some further advances and some further pulling back. To me, it's the nature of social change. So that makes me a little more understanding about what's going on, and a little more optimistic about it, even though I too live in the present and am anguished about it. If you take the 1950s and the later 1950s, the Eisenhower years of relative civility and tranquility, I think there's much that we would hanker after in that mood. But a lot of it occurred because a lot of things were papered over. And all these issues of race and gender and environment were simply not articulated, not well addressed, subordinated. So if I had to choose between that world and this one, I'll take this one.
Well,
Well, I'd like to think that there's a substantial population of people who cares about the military and preserving its qualities and recognizing its sacrifices, and at the same time cares about civil liberties and the challenge in some dimension that you began asking about is how we reconcile those two things.